Hey team, we're going to cover some basic patterns of inheritance in this video, and then in the next videos we'll cover some of the variations of those patterns. Our big idea here though is that characteristics of an organism are determined by their genes, a combination of the genes and the environment interacting. Alright, so we all genes, those pieces of DNA that code for how to build a specific protein or code for a specific trait, right? And those genes are what we inherit from our parents. Yeah. But the environment we're in, or the environment any organism is in, influences how those genes behave, how those genes react, or which genes are turned on or turned off, right? So like in this example, here we have species of the holly bush, right? In areas where there is more intense grazing by deer, so there's more deer around munching on these holly bushes, the leaves will tend to form these spikes. All right, but in areas where there are no deer or much less intense grazing by deer, those spikes do not form. Okay, so these will be organisms that would have the same genes, but the expression of those genes vary depending on the environment that they're in. So even though we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this genotype determines this phenotype, or this set of genes means you're going to have this set of characteristics, it's more complicated than that because genes are constantly interacting with their environment. And if you're thinking this sounds a lot like nature versus nurture, really what I'm saying is that there's no such thing as nature versus nurture. There's nature, your genes, and nurture, your environment. Those two things cannot be separated. That is a fallacious argument that nature versus nurture, it's an and. Nature and nurture determine your characteristics. All right, enough of my little spiel there. So let's jump in. Let's talk about how these traits are inherited, right? So let's start off with some vocab that we use to describe these traits or to describe this process. So we say that our DNA, our genes, determines our physical characteristics, right? Those physical features that we can see or those physical features that we can measure, like physiology, things like that, okay? So when we talk about our DNA, we say our genotype, the genotype that we have, the combination of genes that we have in our genome will determine our phenotype, those physical characteristics that we have, right? It's like this fly right here has green eyes, a blue body, normal wings, and 6 legs. So those phenotypes, those green eyes would be a phenotype, normal oval wings would be a phenotype, blue body would be a phenotype, right? All of those physical characteristics, those phenotypes, would be coded for by their genes and their genotype. Okay, so genotype, the combination of DNA, of genes you have, determines phenotype. Let's just review where our genes come from, right? So many organisms are what we say diploid organisms, meaning we have 2 copies of each chromosome. Yeah. In humans, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, right? One set in that pair came from our maternal parent. The other set in that pair came from our paternal parent, right? So you inherit 1 copy of each chromosome from each parent through the process of gamete formation, and those gametes fuse during fertilization, right? So our chromosomes come in homologous pairs, and on each chromosome, as long as they're in a homologous pair, in the same location on that chromosome, we're going to find the same type of information, right? So like right here on this chromosome right here, we have the locus or the location for this particular gene, this R gene, whatever this might code for. And so we'll find that in the exact same location on both chromosomes. And then a different gene has a different location or locus or loci, if we're talking about multiple locations. Loci is plural. But the information, the type of gene that's there, might not be exactly the same. So they're all going to code for the same basic trait. But they might be variations of that trait, right? Variations of that trait being curly hair or straight hair, or brown hair or black hair, right? So it could be the same type of trait, hair color, right? But different forms of that trait, okay? And we call those different forms of that trait, that's what we call alleles, right? So alleles are Are you going to have brown eyes or are you going to have green eyes? Okay, so that eye color allele has many forms to it. And if we think back, where did those alleles come from? Where do we think those alleles may have come from, right? DNA mutations. Mutations are what drive the creation of new alleles. So new forms of a trait are caused by mutation. Okay, but big idea here, homologous chromosomes. We have in the same location on each homologous chromosome the same basic information, but we might have different forms of that information, different alleles on each chromosome. So we're going to start out with the basic example, right? Some genes we say are dominant to other genes, or some alleles we say are dominant to other alleles. And what that means is that that specific allele only requires one copy on one chromosome in order for that allele to determine the phenotype, in order for that specific gene to drive what physical characteristic that organism has. Versus if it's a recessive allele, both copies of that allele on both chromosomes from the mom and the chromosome from the dad, need to have that recessive version in order to be expressed. Okay, so I have a bunch of dogs here. Okay, so this is an example using dogs. So in dogs, this trait of having short legs, or what we say hypochondroplasia, this trait, this characteristic, comes from a dominant allele. Okay, so that means having normal length legs or typical length legs is a recessive allele. So this is why if we cross any sort of dog that has short legs with a normal length dog, typically we get a dog that looks like we take a husky and a corgi. Corgis have short legs, huskies have normal legs. It kind of looks like a husky, but on short legs, right? That's because that short leg trait, that short leg allele is dominant. Okay, so this dog only needs one copy of this hypochondroplasia allele to have short legs. Okay, so it is a dominant trait. It only requires one copy of that allele in its chromosomes in order to be expressed, in order to determine the phenotype. We're going to talk about some basic patterns of inheritance. We're going to introduce some Punnett squares here. I just want to say, though, that most traits that we find in humans and most other organisms don't follow these typical inheritance patterns, but it's a good place to start as we start to learn about variations of this theme. So when we're talking about genotypes, we use some terms to describe that genotype. Okay, so based on the combination of alleles that we find in that organism's genome, we can say they're either homozygous or heterozygous. So homozygous organisms are organisms that have both copies on their chromosomes are the same allele. So either they have two alleles for short legs with the dominant trait, or they have two alleles for long legs, the recessive trait. Okay, so both of these alleles on both chromosomes are identical. Those would be what we say homozygous. If the alleles are one dominant and one recessive, a short leg trait here and then a long leg allele here, we say they are heterozygous. Okay, so there's two different types of alleles in that locus, and we say they're heterozygous for that trait. Okay, homozygous same, heterozygous different. And if we remember, when we talk about meiosis, right, meiosis separates out these homologous chromosomes into the gametes, right? So these chromosomes will separate out and they'll replicate and then they'll separate out into 4 different gametes. So an individual that is heterozygous like this will form 50% of their gametes will have the dominant allele and 50% of their gametes will have the recessive allele. Okay, so remember, meiosis separates out these homologous chromosomes into their haploid gametes. And as long as we're tracing a trait, as long as it's on different chromosomes, as long as these traits we're tracing are in separate chromosomes, they will be inherited independently. Okay, so we're only looking at one trait right here. But if we maybe looked at another trait, I don't know, like coat color or coat length or something like that, if it's on the same chromosome, it would not be inherited independently. So coat color is like right here on this chromosome, it would be inherited with leg length, right? But if, let's say, coat length was on a different chromosome, it would separate independently. Okay, it would separate into the gametes independently. In this case, these are all going to separate, okay, because we're only looking at one allele right now. And so let's do a test cross. Let's say we have two Corgi mixes. Okay, so these Corgi mixes inherited a short leg gene from their Corgi parent, and then a long leg gene allele from their non-Corgi parents. So we have a Husky Corgi mix, and here we have a Golden Retriever Corgi mix, right? So they got this short leg dominant allele from their Corgi parent, and then they got this long leg recessive allele from their non-Corgi parent. So when these two go to make gametes, remember, half of their gametes will have that short leg allele, and half of their gametes will have that long leg allele. And let's say we're going to breed these together. How could we figure out what percentage of these puppies will have short legs or long legs, right? So this is where we do a Punnett square. So we take our gametes that could be formed. So 50% of our gametes will have the short legs for the mom. 50% of our gametes will have the long legs gene allele for their mom, right? So that's what these letters here represent. These letters represent the allele that could be sent forth through the eggs from the mom. So 50% could have this H allele, and 50% could have this lower H allele. This is recessive allele. Same thing with dad. Let's say the Golden Retriever mix is the dad here. So half of his gametes will have this dominant allele. Okay, so that's what this letter right here represents. This letter represents 50% of the gametes coming from dad could have that short leg allele. The other 50% of gametes that dad will make will have the recessive long leg allele. Okay, so that's what this lowercase h represents. 50% of the gametes will have the possibility of having that recessive long leg allele. Okay, so what would happen if a gamete that had a short leg allele from dad and a short leg allele from mom combined, right? Or what if we had a short leg allele from dad and a long leg allele from dad and a short leg allele from mom? What would happen, right? So these Punnett squares represent probabilities. Okay, so we're just measuring the probability that these two types of gametes, either short leg or long leg from mom and dad, could combine. So what we do is we're going to take each of these letters from the top and the side, and we're going to fill them into the boxes right here, right? And these represent the genotype of the offspring, okay? So we have a dominant homozygous, heterozygous, and a homozygous recessive, okay? So that means we have 1/4, 25% chance that they'll be homozygous dominant, 2 out of 4 that will be heterozygous for the short leg trait, and 1 out of 4 that will be homozygous recessive. So what percentage of our puppies on average, given that these gametes will randomly recombine, right? What percentage of our puppies on average will have long legs or short legs? So remember, as long as we only have one of these dominant H alleles, that puppy will have short legs. If we have 2 of these recessive alleles, they will have long legs, right? So here we have 1, 2, 3 probability, 3 outcomes out of 4 that could have short legs. So 3 out of 4, or 75% of our puppies will have short legs on average. And then 1 out of 4, or 25% of our puppies right here, this combination would have long legs. All right, so we call this a single trait Punnett square, or what we call a monohybrid cross. We're looking, mono meaning one, we're looking at just one trait, okay? So go ahead and practice with this with some other examples. We'll pick up in the next video doing 2 traits that we're tracing at once.